When the fire dies, the story of marriage, longing, and the space between two people. Part 1. The stranger in the mirror. Rachel Morrison barely recognized the woman staring back at her from the bathroom mirror at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in October. The fluorescent light above the sink cast a harsh, clinical glow over features that had once been soft, animated, alive with possibility. Now those features, pale, drawn, bearing the invisible but unmistakable weight of exhaustion, seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Someone who had wandered into her life and refused to leave. She was 28 years old, a senior UI designer at a mid-sized tech consultancy in Austin, Texas, and she could not remember the last time her husband had touched her with anything resembling desire. The bathroom tiles were cold beneath her bare feet. She could hear Brian moving around in the bedroom, the familiar creak of the mattress as he got up, the mundane sounds of a man beginning another ordinary day. She listened to those sounds the way a sailor might listen to the wind before a storm, searching for some sign, some omen, some indication of what was coming next. But there was nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of ordinary life, the kind of life she had once believed would be sufficient to sustain her. It wasn't. She knew that now, with the kind of certainty that settles into your bones like winter frost. She turned away from the mirror and stepped into the shower, letting the water run scalding hot over her shoulders until the bathroom filled with steam and she could pretend, just for a moment, that the moisture on her face was merely condensation. The apartment they shared, a modest 2-bedroom in the Mueller neighborhood, one of Austin's many neighborhoods that had been slowly colonized by young professionals with graduate degrees and unsustainable amounts of debt, was quiet in the way that only empty marriages are quiet. There was no fighting, no drama, no raised voices or slammed doors. There was simply the absence of sound where there should have been connection. A silence so vast and so complete that it had become, in its own way, a kind of violence. Rachel had been with Brian for 7 years. Married for 2 of those years. Mother to their daughter, Sophie, for 14 months. And in all that time, particularly in the past 18 months, since the pregnancy had fundamentally altered the topography of her body and the architecture of her identity, she had been slowly, almost imperceptibly, disappearing. She had not disappeared all at once. It had happened the way most devastating things happen, gradually, then all at once. One small withdrawal at a time, one ignored conversation, one unmade bed, until the woman who stood in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger because she had spent so long being unseen that she had begun to vanish from her own reflection. She had tried to talk to Brian about it. She had tried, in those careful, measured conversations that couples have when they are circling a wound and afraid to touch it directly. She had said things like, "I feel like we're growing apart and I miss us, and don't you think we should make time for each other?" And Brian had nodded and said, "Yeah, I hear you and we should do something about that," and then he had gone back to his laptop or his phone or the spreadsheet he was perpetually working on, and the moment had passed, and the silence had returned, and Rachel had been left. Standing in the kitchen of her own home, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She was 28 years old, and she felt like a widow. Part 2. The beginning. Brian and Rachel had met at the University of Texas at Austin, where she'd been pursuing a degree in digital arts and he'd been working toward a business degree with a minor in computer science. They met at a campus coffee shop called The Orb, the kind of place that smelled perpetually of burnt espresso and philosophical debate, where graduate students gathered to argue about Foucault and undergraduate came to seem more intellectual than they actually were. She remembered the exact moment she'd first noticed him, a late autumn afternoon, the light slanting through the large windows in thick golden beams, dust motes suspended in the air like tiny frozen stars. He was sitting at a corner table with 2 other people, laughing at something someone had said, and when he laughed, his whole face changed, the careful, guarded expression he usually wore melted away, and what remained was something raw and unguarded and achingly young. She had looked at that face and thought, I want to know who put that smile there. I want to be the reason for that smile. He was handsome in an unpretentious way, tall, lean, with dark hair that had a tendency to fall across his forehead and eyes the color of strong coffee. He wore glasses that he clearly didn't need, just for the aesthetic, and he had a habit of pushing them up his nose when he was thinking. She had watched him do this dozens of times in the weeks that followed, cataloging his gestures the way a designer might catalog color swatches or typographic choices. They started talking. Then they started meeting for coffee. Then they started meeting for dinner. Then they were spending every spare moment together, a pair of magnets who couldn't resist each other's pull. Within 3 months, they'd moved into a shared apartment near campus, a one-bedroom place with thin walls and a radiator that clanked like a poltergeist every 20 minutes. But it was theirs, and in those early months, that was all that mattered. The sex, in those first 3 years, had been extraordinary. Rachel had never experienced anything like it. The way he looked at her, the way he touched her, the hours they spent learning each other's bodies like cartographers mapping undiscovered territory. They were young and hungry and completely, recklessly absorbed in each other. There were afternoons when they never made it out of bed. There were evenings that dissolved into tangled limbs and breathless laughter and the kind of intimacy that makes you believe, genuinely believe, that you have found the secret to the universe. Rachel had believed, with the naive certainty of someone who had never been truly disappointed, that this was what love was supposed to feel like. That it would last forever. That the fire between them was not just a fire but a furnace, a permanent installation, something that would warm them for the rest of their days. She hadn't known, then, how fragile happiness could be. How easily it could be dismantled by the ordinary pressures of adult life, mortgage payments and career disappointments and the slow, imperceptible drift of two people who once orbited each other now settling into separate, increasingly distant trajectories. She hadn't known that love, like a muscle, could atrophy from disuse. That the most dangerous threat to a relationship was not conflict but its absence, not fighting about everything, but slowly forgetting why you had chosen each other in the first place. Part 3. The investment. The idea to buy the investment property had seemed so sensible at the time. Rachel had been reading article after article about real estate, about the smart money moving into rental properties, about the importance of building wealth through property ownership rather than throwing money away on rent. Brian had been similarly seduced by the idea, by the prospect of owning something tangible, something that would appreciate in value while they slept. They had found the property in Round Rock, a 2-bedroom condo in a mid-rise building about 20 minutes north of downtown Austin. It was a foreclosure, which meant it was priced below market value, which meant they could afford the down payment without completely depleting their savings. The rental market in the area was strong. They could easily fetch $1,600 a month in rent, which would more than cover the mortgage and property taxes. It was, on paper, the perfect investment. Rachel remembered the day they'd closed on the property. They'd stood in the empty condo with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and Brian had put his arm around her and said, "This is us building our future." And Rachel had felt a flutter of something, excitement, maybe, or the pleasant dizziness of taking a gamble on something that felt bigger than themselves. She had believed, as in that moment, that they were doing something mature and responsible, something that would pay dividends for years to come. But the renovation costs had been staggering. The property had been neglected for years, water damage in the bathroom, a cracked kitchen floor, outdated electrical work that needed to be completely replaced. Rachel had been optimistic at first, driven by the same naivete that had once made her believe love was eternal. She had watched the renovation shows on HGTV and believed, absurdly, that renovation was a linear process with predictable outcomes. You spent money, you got results, and then you collected your reward. The reality was different. The reality was change orders and permit delays and contractors who didn't show up when they said they would. The reality was watching their savings evaporate like morning fog as the renovation dragged on for months beyond its projected end date. The reality was a line of credit that had seemed, at the time, like a manageable extension of their finances, but which had quickly become a weight around their necks that grew heavier with each passing month. The rental income never materialized as projected. The property manager they'd hired to handle tenant screening and maintenance was incompetent at best and fraudulent at worst. Within 6 months of listing the condo on rental sites, they had a tenant who had stopped paying rent and refused to leave. The eviction process took months. During that time, Rachel and Brian were still making mortgage payments on an empty property while simultaneously paying rent on the apartment where they actually lived. The financial pressure was crushing. Rachel found herself lying awake at night, running the numbers over and over in her head, looking for some calculation, some approach, some miracle that would allow them to climb out of the hole they dug for themselves. Brian, meanwhile, had become withdrawn, irritable, distant. The easy laughter that had once defined him was replaced by a tight-lipped tension that seemed to infect every room he entered. He stopped talking about the future. He stopped talking about them. He came home from work later and later, and when he was home, he was somewhere else entirely, a million miles away, trapped inside his own anxious calculations about interest rates and debt-to-income ratios and all the other numbers that had come to define their lives. Rachel tried to the understanding. She told herself that anyone would be stressed under these circumstances, that this was a temporary phase, that things would get better once the property was rented and the debt was under control. But inside, something was shifting. Something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the slow, almost imperceptible disappearance of the man she had married. Part 4. The pregnancy had been unplanned. Rachel had been on birth control, but imperfectly. Sometimes she forgot a pill, sometimes she took it at irregular hours, the kind of small carelessness that seemed harmless until it wasn't. When she saw the positive result on the pregnancy test, her first emotion was not joy or excitement but a deep, instinctual terror that seemed to originate somewhere in the pit of her stomach and radiate outward through every nerve in her body. She had told Brian in the kitchen of their apartment, early on a Saturday morning, while the coffee maker gurgled on the counter and the pale autumn light streamed through the window. She remembered the exact expression on his face, the way his features seemed to freeze, like a photograph capturing a moment of profound ambivalence. He had nodded slowly, said something non-committal like that's a lot to process, and then he had gone to the living room and sat on the couch and stared at the wall for the better part of an hour. They had decided, after much deliberation, to get married before the baby was born. It had seemed like the responsible thing to do, the conventional thing, the thing that people did. Rachel had tried to convince herself that the decision was rooted in love and commitment, but the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that they were both terrified of the social implications of an out-of-wedlock birth, and so they had scheduled a small ceremony at the Travis County Courthouse, with just a handful of family members in attendance, and they had said "I do" in front of a judge who had clearly performed this particular ritual hundreds of times and felt nothing at all. The wedding itself had been a quiet affair, a far cry from the celebration Rachel had imagined for herself as a little girl, the kind of wedding that exists in fairy tales and romantic comedies. She had worn a simple ivory dress that she'd bought on sale at a department store. Brian had worn a navy suit that he would never wear again. There had been no flowers, no live music, no dancing. Just the signing of documents and a dinner at a mid-range Tex-Mex restaurant and the shared, unspoken awareness that this was not the beginning either of them had envisioned. The marriage, from the very beginning, felt less like a celebration and more like a concession, a compromise forced upon them by circumstance rather than chosen freely. And once the baby was born, the compromises only multiplied. During her pregnancy, Rachel had experienced the full range of physical discomforts, nausea that seemed to have no relationship to time of day, a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, achy joints and swollen feet, and a constantly irritated bladder that made a full night's sleep feel like a distant memory. She had expected Brian to be supportive, to step up, to help carry the burden of her physical discomfort the way partners are supposed to do. She had expected the kind of tenderness that characterized their early years together, the hand on her back, the foot rubs after long days, the middle of the night runs to satisfy strange cravings. Instead, Brian had become more distant than ever. He was working later, sleeping less, seeming more agitated by the day. Rachel understood, intellectually, that he was stressed about the finances, about the impending arrival of a child they couldn't really afford, about all the uncertainties that parenthood would bring. But understanding his stress did not make her feel any less alone in dealing with her own. She remembered one particular evening, late in her second trimester, when she had called Brian from the train station, the Austin Metro, coming back from a work trip, and asked him to pick her up. The station was in a sketchy part of town, and she was tired and her feet were swollen and she had a splitting headache. She had imagined him being there, imagined the small comfort of his presence, the drive home together during which they might actually talk, might actually connect. Instead, he had said he was busy, that she should take an Uber, and he had hung up before she could respond. She had stood on that platform as the evening darkness settled over the city, feeling something inside her crack and harden into a shape that would be difficult, later, to break. She had taken the Uber home in silence, staring out the window at the passing lights of the city, and she had thought, this is my life now. This is who I married. A man who cannot be bothered to pick me up when I'm pregnant with his child. She had tried to forgive him. She had told herself that everyone handles stress differently, that she shouldn't take it personally, that the Brian she knew and loved was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of anxiety and financial pressure. But the hurt had settled into her bones, and no amount of rationalization could dislodge it. Sophie was born in April, during a week of unseasonably warm weather that made the hospital room feel stifling and airless. The delivery itself had been grueling, 17 hours of labor followed by an emergency C-section that Rachel had not anticipated and for which she had not prepared. She had emerged from the experience feeling hollowed out, as though something vital had been scooped from inside her and replaced with silence. The first few weeks with the baby had been a blur of feedings and diaper changes and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made ordinary thought difficult. Rachel had been given 4 months of maternity leave, and during that time, she had tried to adjust to the new reality of her life, the reality of being responsible for a helpless human being who needed her for everything, who would die without her constant attention and care. She had also been adjusting, in those weeks, to the new reality of her marriage. And that reality was this: Brian no longer touched her. Not in the way he used to. Not with desire or affection or even basic human warmth. The touches that remained were purely functional, the brush of his hand. When he passed her in the hallway, the perfunctory pat on the shoulder when he came home from work. These were the touches of a roommate, of a co-parent, of someone sharing living space and nothing more. She had tried, in the early weeks, to initiate intimacy. She had put the baby to bed early and changed into something soft and alluring and sat on the edge of the bed with a glass of wine and an openness that she had hoped would communicate what she wanted. Brian had come into the bedroom, looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then said he was exhausted and was going to sleep on the couch. She had told herself it was the stress. The stress of a new baby, the stress of the debt, the stress of everything. She had told herself that things would improve once the baby was older, once they were more rested, once the financial pressure eased. She had constructed an entire mythology of future improvement, a future in which the man she had married would return to her, would want her again, would see her as something more than a roommate and co-parent. But the months passed and nothing improved. If anything, the distance between them grew wider, the silence grew deeper. Brian had taken to sleeping on the couch most nights, claiming that his snoring disturbed the baby, though Rachel suspected the truth was simpler and more painful. He simply didn't want to be near her. She had started to feel like a ghost in her own house, present but invisible, contributing but unseen. She was the mother of his child, the woman who shared his address, and she was, in every way that mattered, completely alone. Part 5. Marcus Chen had joined the design team at Catalyst Consulting in September, during the week that the Texas summer finally relented and gave way to something resembling autumn. He was 34, a senior product designer who had moved to Austin from San Francisco after a breakup that he described, with characteristic self-deprecating humor, as a mutually assured destruction that somehow managed to destroy only me. He was tall, about 6'1", with a swimmer's build and the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested he spent time and money on his personal presentation. He had a square jaw, dark eyes that seemed to change color depending on the light, and a smile that arrived slowly, deliberately, as though he was giving you the opportunity to appreciate its full effect before committing to it. He dressed well, not in the aggressively trendy way of some San Francisco transplants, but in a way that suggested genuine taste and an understanding of what looked good on a human body. He wore jeans that fit perfectly and button-down shirts that did exactly what shirts are supposed to do, which is to say they made you want to take them off. Rachel had noticed him immediately, the way you notice a beautiful painting in a museum, not necessarily because you're in the market for a painting, but because beauty demands attention whether you want to give it or not. He had introduced himself at the Monday morning team meeting with a confidence that was refreshing in an office environment where most people performed a kind of aggressive mediocrity, and Rachel had found herself watching him as he spoke, watching the way his mouth moved and his hands gestured, and thinking about things she had no business thinking about. She had pushed those thoughts away, of course. She was married. She was a mother. She had responsibilities and obligations and a set of values that she had spent years constructing, brick by brick, and she was not about to dismantle them because a handsome new coworker had walked into her office and made her pulse quicken in a way it hadn't quickened in years. But she noticed him. She couldn't help but notice him. They had started working together on a client project within a few weeks of his arrival, a major redesign of a healthcare platform that would require close collaboration between the UX research team and the visual design team. The project meetings were held in a glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor, a room that Rachel had always found slightly oppressive but which had acquired, in those weeks, a different quality entirely. She found herself looking forward to those meetings with an anticipation that was embarrassing to acknowledge, even to herself. Marcus was easy to talk to, easier, in some ways, than anyone she had talked to in years. He listened with his whole body, turning toward her when she spoke, nodding in ways that suggested genuine engagement, asking follow-up questions that revealed he was actually processing what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. He had a way of making her feel seen, of making her feel like her thoughts and opinions were not just heard but valued. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, about the pressures of new motherhood, about the exhaustion that had become her constant companion, about the strange grief she felt for the woman she had been before Sophie was born. And he listened without judgment, without the kind of advice that she didn't want, without the dismissive "you'll get through it" that she had heard from everyone else. He simply listened, and in his listening, made her feel less alone than she had felt in months. One evening, during a late-night working session to meet a project deadline, they had been alone in the conference room, surrounded by the detritus of a long day, coffee cups and laptops, and the printed mock-ups that were scattered across the conference table like the ruins of some ancient civilization. Marcus had leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as searching. "You seem tired," he had said. Not accusatory, not judgmental. Just observational. Just kind. "I am tired," she had admitted. He had nodded slowly, as though her tiredness was something he understood intimately, something he had experienced himself. "Can I ask you something personal?" he had said, and before she could answer, he had continued, "Are you happy?" The question had caught her off guard. Nobody had asked her that in years, not her husband, not her friends, not her therapist. She had been so busy surviving, so consumed by the daily logistics of childcare and financial stress and marital silence, that she hadn't stopped to consider whether she was happy or not. The question had landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she had felt the ripples spreading outward through every part of her body. "No," she had said before she could stop herself. "No, I'm not." He had looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was something that she recognized immediately, something that went beyond professional collaboration, beyond the boundaries that are supposed to govern the interactions of married people and their colleagues. There was a wanting in that look, a recognition, an acknowledgement of the same hunger she felt whenever she looked at him. The air between them had felt charged, electric, the way the air feels before a summer thunderstorm. She had wanted to reach across the table and touch him. She had wanted to close the distance between them and let herself fall into whatever was on the other side. She had wanted, with an intensity that frightened her, to be seen, to be wanted, to be reminded that she was still a woman capable of desire and of being desired. She had not done any of those things. She had gathered her laptop and her mock-ups and she had said, "I should get home," and she had left. But as she drove home through the dark Austin streets, she had felt the ghost of his gaze on her, and she had known, with the same certainty that she knew her own name, that something had shifted. That something irreversible had begun. Part 6. Derek Palmer had been at Catalyst consulting longer than almost anyone. He was 41, a senior account manager who handled the firm's relationships with its largest and most lucrative clients. He was the kind of man who had always been popular, the high school quarterback who never quite grew up, who still approached life with the same combination of charisma and competitiveness that had once won him trophies and accolades and the undying admiration of his peers. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, the kind of handsome that comes from living hard and caring less. He had a shaved head and a closely trimmed beard and forearms that were more muscular than a man of his age and profession had any business having. He worked out obsessively, she had heard, spending 2 hours every morning at the gym before driving to the office. There was something almost aggressive about his physical maintenance, as though his body was a fortress that he was constantly reinforcing against an enemy he couldn't name. Derek had always been friendly toward Rachel, friendly in the way that certain men are friendly toward women they find attractive, which is to say, friendly in a way that contains multitudes. He complimented her work. He asked about her daughter. He remembered small details from conversations they'd had weeks earlier and referenced them casually, as though she was someone worth remembering. She had always assumed his friendliness was harmless, the social lubrication of a man who had never learned to be uncomfortable around anyone. But lately, something had changed. Or perhaps she had changed. Perhaps the hunger that Marcus had awakened in her had spilled over into her other interactions, had made her hyper-aware of the currents of attraction that ran beneath the surface of professional relationships like underground rivers. She noticed the way Derek looked at her when she passed his desk, the lingering quality of his gaze, the way his eyes tracked her movement with an attention that was difficult to misinterpret. She noticed the way he found excuses to be near her, the impromptu meetings that turned into extended conversations, the coffee runs that seemed to synchronize with her own trips to the break room, the casual touches that he deployed with surgical precision, a hand on her lower back as he passed, a finger's brush against her wrist when handing her a document. One afternoon, in the elevator going down to the parking garage, he had stood close enough to her that she could smell his cologne, a sharp, spicy scent that seemed to penetrate her defenses in a way that nothing else could. The elevator had been empty except for the two of them, and for a moment, with the doors closing and the car beginning its descent, she had felt the same charged electricity that she had felt with Marcus in the conference room. "You're too beautiful to be this unhappy," he had said, quietly, almost to himself, as though he had not meant to say it, as though the words had escaped him against his will. She had not known what to say. She had felt the heat rise to her face, felt her pulse quicken in her throat, felt the impossible weight of temptation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The elevator had continued its descent in silence, and when the doors had opened on the parking level, she had stepped out without looking back. But his words had stayed with her. They had burrowed into her mind and taken up residence there, recurring in her thoughts at unexpected moments, while she was nursing Sophie in the rocking chair in the nursery at 2 a.m., while she was eating dinner alone in the kitchen because Brian was still working, while she was lying in bed staring at the ceiling and counting the minutes until morning. "You're too beautiful to be this unhappy." She knew it was wrong. She knew that the thoughts she was having were dangerous, destructive, capable of dismantling the fragile architecture of her life in ways she could not predict and might not survive. She was a married woman, a mother, a professional. She had responsibilities and obligations and a set of values that she had believed, until recently, were non-negotiable. But sitting alone in a nursery at 2 a.m., watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with the rhythm of sleep, Rachel had felt something inside her fracture along fault lines she had not known existed. She had married Brian because she loved him, or because she had believed, at 22, that the feeling in her chest when she looked at him was love, which may or may not have been the same thing. She had believed, in those early years, that love was sufficient, that it could carry two people through any difficulty, any challenge, any pressures. She had been wrong. Love, she had learned, was not sufficient. Love was not even necessary, perhaps, for the kind of partnership that characterized most adult relationships. What mattered was presence, attention, the daily, unglamorous, unsexy work of showing up for another person and making them feel like they mattered. Brian had stopped doing that work, had stopped showing up in any way that counted, and in its absence, Rachel had slowly starved. She did not know, anymore, if she loved her husband. She did not know if she had ever loved him, or if what she had felt in those early years was something else entirely, infatuation, perhaps, or the intoxication of new desire, or simply the comfort of being chosen by someone who seemed to want her. She did not know if the problem was Brian, or the circumstances, or herself. She did not know if the hunger she felt was a sign of something broken inside her, or a sign that something inside her was finally, after years of suppression, waking up. All she knew was that she was standing at the edge of a cliff, and that the wind was picking up, and that it would not be long now before she made a decision that she could not take back. Part 7. The dinner, the work happy hour, had been Marcus's idea, or at least, that was what everyone said, though Rachel suspected the firm's partners had been looking for an excuse to drink on a Thursday and had simply recruited Marcus as their willing frontman. The venue was a rooftop bar in downtown Austin called the Monarch, the kind of place that catered to young professionals with more disposable income than good taste, where the cocktail cost $18 and the view of the city skyline was obscured by a persistent haze of craft cocktail smoke. Rachel had not planned to stay long. She had arranged for her mother to watch Sophie, which meant she had approximately 3 hours of freedom before the baby would need to be fed again, and she had intended to make an appearance, have a drink or two, demonstrate collegiality, and leave before the event devolved into the kind of awkward networking that she had no patience for. But then Marcus had found her. He had materialized beside her at the bar with the uncanny timing of someone who had been watching her from across the room, and perhaps he had been, because she had felt, for the past hour, the weight of his gaze on her like a hand pressed against her back. He had ordered a whiskey neat and she had ordered a second glass of wine, and they had stood side by side at the bar, looking out at the skyline, and for a while neither of them had said anything at all. The city sprawled beneath them, glittering with lights, indifferent to the small dramas of the people drinking above it. Rachel had always loved Austin for its strange beauty, the way it mixed hill country charm with Silicon Hills ambition, the way it managed to feel both cosmopolitan and unapologetically weird. But tonight, looking out at the skyline, she felt only the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be. "I keep thinking about what you said," Marcus had said, finally. That night in the conference room. About not being happy. She had felt her face grow warm. "I shouldn't have said that." "Why not?" "Because it's not professional. Because we're colleagues." Because she had stopped herself before she said the thing that mattered, the thing that was sitting in her chest like a coal, burning. Because he had prompted gently. She had turned to look at him. He was even more handsome up close than he was from a distance, which she had not thought possible. His eyes, in the low light of the bar, were almost black, and there was a quality of intensity in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. "Because I'm married," she had said. The words had come out quieter than she had intended, more fragile. He had nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he already knew. "I know," he had said. "I know you are." The silence that followed had been different from the silences she shared with Brian, the silences that were filled with avoidance and unspoken resentment and the heavy weight of things that could not be said. This silence was charged, warm, full of possibility. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something and choosing, in that moment, not to step back. "I should go," she had said, though she had not moved. "You should," he had agreed. But he had not moved either. They had stood there for what felt like a very long time, two people sharing space and air and the unspoken awareness of a mutual attraction that neither of them seemed capable of denying. And then, almost imperceptibly, his hand had found hers, fingers interlacing with hers on the polished surface of the bar, and she had felt something in her chest crack open, like a door that had been locked for years finally giving way. She had pulled her hand away. She had gathered her purse and she had walked out of the bar and she had driven home through the dark Austin streets with the windows down and the radio playing something loud and angry and perfect, and she had cried for most of the drive, though she could not have said with certainty whether she was crying from guilt or grief or something else entirely, the release, perhaps, of a feeling that had been building inside her for months and had finally found an outlet, however inadequate. Part 8. The confession she had told Brian about Marcus over dinner, a frozen pizza that they had reheated in the oven because neither of them had the energy or the motivation to cook anything real. Sophie was asleep in the nursery down the hall, and the apartment was quiet in the way that it was only quiet when something important was about to happen. Rachel had been building up the courage to have this conversation for weeks. She had rehearsed it in her head 100 times, trying to find the right words, the right tone, the right balance between honesty and accusation. She had wanted to tell him without hurting him. She had wanted to confess without destroying. She had wanted, in other words, the impossible, to be seen for who she really was, and to be loved anyway. "I think someone at work has a crush on me," she had said, trying to keep her voice light, casual, as though this was a piece of gossip she was sharing rather than a confession that was eating her alive from the inside. Brian had looked up from his pizza. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. A guy on my team. He's being attentive in ways that feel like more than professional." "Which guy?" She had hesitated. Saying his name aloud, in this room, in this marriage, felt like an act of violence against Brian, against herself, against the fragile fiction of normality they had been maintaining for so long. "Marcus," she had said, finally. "Marcus Chen." Brian had set down his pizza. He had taken off his glasses, which he still wore, out of habit, though he had stopped needing them years ago, and he had rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. When he looked at her again, his expression was unreadable. "And how do you feel about that?" The question had been so unexpected, so stripped of the anger or jealousy or hurt that she had braced herself for, that she had not known how to answer. She had opened her mouth and then closed it again, like a fish that had been pulled from the water and was now gasping on the shore. "I don't know," she had said, and it was the truth. She did not know if what she felt for Marcus was attraction or gratitude or simply the desperate hunger for someone, anyone, to see her, to acknowledge her, to make her feel like she was more than just a machine that produces childcare and mortgage payment and the illusion of a functioning household. She did not know if the problem was Marcus, or if Marcus was simply the mirror in which she was seeing, for the first time, the full scope of what her marriage had become. "Is that supposed to make me jealous?" Brian had said, and there was something in his tone, a sharpness, an edge, that she hadn't heard in months. "Because honestly, Rach, I'm having a hard time caring about who at your office thinks you're cute. I'm a little busy trying to figure out how we're going to pay for Sophie's daycare next month." The words had landed like a slap. She had sat there, frozen, feeling the blood drain from her face, feeling the walls of the room contract around her. She had told him that another man was interested in her, and his response had been to talk about money. "Right," she had said, quietly. "Right. Of course." She had pushed back from the table and she had gone to the nursery and she had stood over Sophie's crib and she had watched her daughter sleep, and she had made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a decision that involved lawyers or apartments or the of her family. Just a small, quiet decision, the kind that happens in the space between one breath and the next. She had decided to stop waiting. To stop waiting for Brian to notice her, to want her, to show up for her in the way that she needed. She had decided that if he was not going to fight for her, she was going to fight for herself. Part 9, the reckoning. The weeks that followed the confession were the strangest of Rachel's life. Something had shifted in the architecture of her marriage. A wall had come down, or perhaps a wall had gone up, she couldn't tell which. Brian had begun, for the first time in months, to look at her. Really look at her, as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time. He had started asking about her day. He had started cooking dinner on weekends. He had started touching her again, not in the way he used to, not with the desperate hunger of their early years, but with a tentative, exploratory quality that suggested he was relearning the geography of a body he had allowed himself to forget. Had the confession changed things? Had the mere mention of another man's interest awakened something in him, a possessiveness, a jealousy, a recognition of what he stood to lose? Rachel did not know, and she was not sure she wanted to know. She was content, for the moment, to let the mystery exist without solving it, to accept the changed quality of Brian's attention as the gift it appeared to be, even if she could not trust that it would last. Marcus, for his part, had become scrupulously professional. He maintained a polite distance in meetings, offered no lingering glances, engaged with her only in contexts that were strictly work-related. It was, Rachel thought, the most adult thing anyone had ever done in her presence, and it made her want him more, not less, because it suggested a discipline and a respect for boundaries that she found, perversely, deeply attractive. Derek, meanwhile, had not changed at all. If anything, his attentions had intensified, become more overt. He found excuses to touch her, a hand on her back, a brush of his fingers against her arm, a closeness in meetings that left very little space between their bodies. He had started sending her messages on the company chat platform, casual, collegial messages that she knew were not casual at all, and she had found herself responding with an enthusiasm that shamed her. She was standing at a crossroads. She could feel it in her bones, in the strange electric quality of the air around her, in the way every decision felt suddenly momentous, weighted with consequences that she could not fully anticipate. She had spent the past 2 years feeling invisible, unheard, unloved, and now, suddenly, she was being seen and wanted, and she did not know how to process the overwhelming intensity of those feelings. She thought about her daughter. She thought about Sophie, asleep in the nursery down the hall, innocent and unaware of the storm that was building around her. She thought about the kind of mother she wanted to be, the kind who was present and loving and emotionally available, and she knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that she could not be that mother if she continued to live the way she had been living. If she continued to deny herself, to suppress her needs, to convince herself that survival was the same as happiness. She thought about Brian and the early years and the fire that had once burned between them. She wondered if it could be rekindled, or if what remained was only ash and the memory of heat. She thought about Marcus and the hand on hers at the bar, and the way he had said, "I know you're married," as though acknowledged in an insurmountable obstacle that he nonetheless refused to stop wanting to climb. She thought about Derek and his whispered words in the elevator and the simple, uncomplicated wanting that he offered without conditions or complications. She thought about herself, about the girl she had been at 22, full of hope and desire and the naive conviction that love would be enough. She wondered where that girl had gone and whether she could find her again. Part 10. The night it happened on a Friday in November, during a rainstorm that turned the Austin streets into rivers of reflected light. Brian was out of town for a business conference, a conference he had complained about attending, had called a waste of time and a disruption to his routine, and Rachel had encouraged him to go because she thought they both needed the space, the distance, the break from the suffocating weight of their own dysfunction. Her mother had come over to watch Sophie, and after putting the baby to bed, Rachel had found herself standing in her living room, alone, with the rain drumming against the windows and a glass of wine in her hand and nowhere to be and nothing to do and no one watching. She had picked up her phone. She had scrolled through her contact until she found Marcus's name. She had stared at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the call button, feeling the weight of every choice she had ever made pressing down on her like a physical force. The phone had rung twice before he answered. "Rachel?" His voice had been surprised, cautious. "Is everything okay?" "I don't know," she had said. "I don't know if anything is okay." There had been a pause on the other end of the line. She had heard him breathing, heard the faint sounds of a television or a movie playing in the background of his life. "Where are you?" he had asked. Home. Brian's out of town. Another pause. Longer this time. She had heard him processing, weighing, deciding. I'm not going to come over, he had said, finally. Quietly. Firmly. I want you to know that. I'm not going to do that to you, or to him, or to whatever this is that we're both pretending not to feel. She had closed her eyes. I know. But I also want you to know, he had continued, that if you were single, if things were different, I would have asked you out a long time ago. I would have done whatever it took to be with you. Because you're extraordinary. And you deserve to be treated that way. You deserve someone who sees you, Ratch. Who really sees you. She had set the phone down and she had finished her wine and she had gone to bed early and she had lain awake for hours, listening to the rain and thinking about the version of her life that existed on the other side of that phone call, the version in which she was brave enough, or reckless enough, or desperate enough to cross a line she could not uncross. She had not asked him to come over. But she had not stopped thinking about him either. Part 11. The letter she had written Brian a letter. Not an email, a letter, handwritten, on paper, the kind of artifact that carries a weight and a permanence that digital communication cannot replicate. She had sat at the kitchen table after Sophie had gone to sleep and she had written for an hour, covering 3 pages with her cramped, increasingly illegible handwriting, saying everything she had been afraid to say for 2 years. She had written about the night at the train station when he had refused to pick her up. She had written about the months of silence, the separate bedrooms, the absence of touch and warmth and any of the small daily intimacies that distinguish a marriage from a business arrangement. She had written about Marcus, not as an accusation, not as a threat, but as a mirror. As evidence of what she had been missing. She had written, I need you to understand that I am not telling you this to hurt you, or to threaten you, or to manipulate you into changing. I am telling you because you deserve to know what has been happening to me, and because I can no longer carry this alone. She had written, I have spent the past 2 years feeling like I am disappearing. Like every day I am becoming less visible, less real, less myself. And I don't know if that is your fault, or my fault, or the fault of circumstance. But I know that I cannot continue like this. I know that something has to change. She had written, I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to show up. I am asking you to try. I am asking you to remember why we were together in the first place, and to decide, whether honestly, this time, whether you still want to be. She had written, I still love you. Or I still love the memory of who you were when we first met, when we couldn't keep our hands off each other, when every touch felt like a promise. I don't know if that person still exists, or if he was ever real at all. But I need to know. I need to know if there's something left to save here, or if I'm just staying out of fear. She had left the letter on his pillow, where he would find it when he came home from his conference on Sunday evening. She had not told him it was there. She had simply placed it there, like a grenade with the pin pulled, and she had retreated to the kitchen to pour herself a second glass of wine and wait. She had waited for 2 days. And in those 2 days, Brian had not said a single word about the letter. He had come home from his conference, had kissed her and Sophie as though nothing had changed, had unpacked his suitcase and done the laundry and played with the baby on the living room floor. And Rachel had watched him with a growing sense of dread, wondering if he had found the letter at all, wondering if he had read it and chosen to ignore it, wondering if the silence was better or worse than the conversation she had been hoping for. On Tuesday evening, she had come home from work to find Brian sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of him. His glass was off and his eyes red-rimmed as though he had been crying or hadn't slept or both. Part 12. The aftermath. He had read the letter at the kitchen table, Rachel had watched him from the doorway, the way his face changed as he read, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes moved faster across the page, the way his hands, holding the paper, began to tremble slightly. She had never seen him read anything with such intensity, such focus. It was, she thought, as though the letter had forced him to see something he had been deliberately refusing to see. When he finished, he had set the letter down on the table and he had looked at her for a long moment without speaking. And in that look was something she had not seen in years, something that looked, impossibly, like fear. "I didn't know," he had said. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize that your wife was drowning? Or you didn't realize that you had stopped caring whether she was or not?" The question had been harsher than she had intended, more cruel. But she had been carrying it for so long, this anger, and she could not find a way to set it down gently. "Both," he had said, quietly. "I think both." They had talked until 3 in the morning. They had talked about the investment property and the debt and the fear that had governed his behavior for the past 2 years, the fear of failure, of inadequacy, of being unable to provide for his family in the way he had always assumed he would. He had been ashamed, he admitted. Ashamed of the financial mess they were in, ashamed of needing her income to cover the mortgage payments, ashamed of feeling like a failure at the one thing he had always believed he would be good at, being a provider. "I didn't know how to talk about it," he had said. "I didn't know how to admit that I was scared. So I just stopped. I know that's not an excuse. I know it's not acceptable. But that's what happened." Rachel had listened. She had listened to all of it, the fear and the shame and the slow, creeping withdrawal that had calcified into habit. She had listened because she understood, in a way she had not understood before, how it had happened. Not just to him, but to both of them. How 2 people could drift apart not through any single catastrophic event but through 1,000 small failures of attention, small failures of communication, small failures of courage. She had confessed about the happy hour, about the hand-holding at the bar, about the phone call on the night Brian was out of town. She had not held anything back because she believed that the only way out was through, and through meant telling the truth, all of it, even the parts that shamed her. Brian had listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, there had been a long silence, the kind of silence that felt like the calm before a storm, or perhaps the silence after the storm has passed and you're taking stock of what's left standing. "Marcus Chen," he had said, finally. Not with anger. With something that sounded almost like respect. "The guy from the design team." "Yes." "Did anything ever actually happen?" "No. Nothing happened. Nothing physical. Nothing real. It was just," she had stopped, searching for the right word. "It was just the idea of him, maybe. The idea that someone could still want me." Brian had nodded slowly. "I understand that," he had said. "I don't like it. I don't like thinking about you wanting someone else. But I understand it." They had agreed to try. Not to fix everything overnight, not to pretend that a single conversation could undo 2 years of damage, but to try to recommit to the difficult, unglamorous work of building something together that neither of them had ever fully built before. They had agreed to start couples therapy. They had agreed to be honest, even when honesty was painful. They had agreed to treat their marriage as a project, something that required maintenance and attention and the willingness to show up even when showing up was hard. It was not a resolution. It was barely even a beginning. But it was more than they had possessed in months, and for Rachel, at that moment, it was enough. Part 13. The choice Marcus had left the company in January. He had received an offer from a firm in Seattle, a better title, a significant raise, a chance to work on projects that were more ambitious and more interesting than anything Catalyst had offered him. He had told Rachel on her last day, in the elevator going down to the parking garage, in almost exactly the same words he had used to tell her, months earlier, that she was too beautiful to be this unhappy. "I'm leaving," he had said. "I wanted you to hear it from me." She had nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I want you to know," he had continued, "that I never intended to be the reason for anything. I never wanted to be the thing that broke something that was already broken. I saw you, and I couldn't stop seeing you. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry if my seeing you caused you pain." The elevator had continued its descent in silence. Rachel had stared at the floor indicator, the numbers counting down like a countdown to something, or perhaps the countdown away from something, and she had thought about all the ways this could have gone differently. All the doors that had been closed in the past year, all the paths not taken, all the choices that had led her to this moment in this elevator with this man who saw her when she had felt invisible for so long. "I appreciate you telling me," she had finally said. Her voice had sounded strange to her own ears, steadier than she felt, more controlled. "And I appreciate the way you've handled this. The professionalism. The boundaries. It means more than you know." He had smiled, a sad smile, the kind of smile you give to someone when you both know that something is ending that cannot begin again. "Take care of yourself, Rach," he had said. "You deserve to be happy. Whatever that looks like for you." She had stepped out of the elevator without looking at him. She had walked to her car and she had sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel and her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching his reflection as he walked in the opposite direction toward his own car. She had not cried. She had expected to cry. But instead she had felt something settle inside her, a sense of closure, of completion, of a door closing that she had been standing in front of for too long. She had driven home to her husband and her daughter and the difficult, complicated, imperfect life that she had chosen, and that, she was beginning to understand, had chosen her right back. Derek, she had declined. She had done it politely, professionally, without drama or awkwardness. She had looked at him across the conference table one afternoon and she had said, "I'm flattered, Derek. Truly. But I'm working on my marriage and I need you to respect that." He had nodded, had said he understood, had promised to keep things professional. And he had, almost immediately, almost completely, as though the chase had been more appealing than the catch, or as though her clear refusal had earned a respect that her ambiguity had not. Part 14. The therapy the couple's therapist they found was a woman named Dr. Elena Vance, who had an office in a restored bungalow in the Travis Heights neighborhood, the kind of office that felt more like a friend's living room than a medical facility. There were plants everywhere, and comfortable furniture, and the smell of sandalwood incense that Rachel had initially found vaguely irritating but had come to associate, over time, with safety and the possibility of honesty. Dr. Vance was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm, measured demeanor that made you want to tell her things you never told anyone. She listened without judgment, without taking sides, without the kind of partisan advocacy that Rachel had half expected from a therapist who was, after all, being paid by both of them. The early sessions had been excruciating. Rachel and Brian had sat on opposite ends of a small couch, speaking in the careful, hedged language of people who are still afraid of what they might say if they spoke too freely. They had talked about the investment property, about the debt, about the ways that financial stress had colonized every aspect of their lives. They had talked about Sophie's birth and the C-section and the months of physical recovery that had made intimacy feel not just unappealing but actively frightening. They had talked about the distance that had grown between them, the silence that had become its own form of communication. And they had talked about Marcus. Rachel had been dreading this conversation, but Dr. Vance had handled it with a delicacy that made it bearable. She had asked Rachel to describe what had happened, not the details, necessarily, but the shape of it, the feeling, and she had asked Brian to listen without interrupting. And when Brian had finally spoken, what he said surprised her. "I was jealous," he had admitted. "Not the way I should have been, not in a way that made me want to fight for her. But I was jealous. I was jealous that someone else could see her the way I used to see her. And I was angry at him, at her, at myself. But mostly at myself." "Why?" Dr. Vance had asked. "Because I knew," he had said, quietly. "I knew that I had let her disappear. I knew that I had been so wrapped up in my own stuff that I had stopped being her husband in any way that mattered. And when she told me about Marcus, it was like being hit by a truck. Because I realized that I was about to lose her, and I hadn't even noticed she was gone." Rachel had listened to this, and something inside her had shifted. Not healed, nothing that simple, but shifted, like a bone being set back into place after a fracture. She had looked at Brian, really looked at him, and she had seen not the distant, checked-out man she had been living with, but someone she recognized. Someone who was as lost as she was, as frightened, as desperate to find a way back to each other. The therapy had continued for months. They had talked about their childhoods, their families, the ways that their parents' marriages had shaped their expectations of what marriage could be. They had talked about their individual demons, the anxiety that governed Brian's relationship with money and success, the abandonment fear that had always made Rachel desperate to be chosen, to be wanted, to be seen. They had learned to fight differently, not with silence and stonewalling, but with words, even when words were painful. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, things had begun to change. Part 15, the fire spring came to Austin early that year, bringing with it the bluebonnets and the Indian paintbrushes and the particular quality of light that Rachel had always thought of as the city's secret, the way the late afternoon sun turned everything amber and gold, transforming the most ordinary street corner into something that resembled a painting. She and Brian had been in therapy for 4 months. The investment property had finally been rented at below market rate to a tenant who paid reliably and never caused problems, which felt less like a victory than a surrender, but a surrender they could live with. The debt remained, a fact of life rather than a crisis, something they were paying down incrementally rather than something that threatened to swallow them whole. Rachel had started sleeping better. She had started eating breakfast again, real breakfast, with eggs and toast and fruit, the granola bar she used to inhale standing over the kitchen sink. She had started noticing the world around her again, the color of the sky at dusk, the sound of Sophie laughing in the bathtub, the way Brian's face softened when he looked at their daughter. Small things. Ordinary things. But things she had been too exhausted, too hungry, too invisible to notice for years. The sex had not returned to what it had been in the early years. Rachel suspected it never would. The hunger of your 20s is different from the hunger of your 30s, shaped by different hormones and different urgencies. But something else had taken its place, something quieter and perhaps more sustainable. They touched each other now, not just functionally, not just in passing, but deliberately, consciously. The way you touch someone when you remember that touching them is a choice you're making, not a reflex you're performing. Brian had started leaving her notes sometimes. Little notes scrawled on post-it pads, tucked into her wallet or stuck to the bathroom mirror or placed on her pillow when she wasn't looking. The notes said things like "You're amazing" and "I love watching you sleep" and "Thank you for not giving up on us." They were embarrassing, in the way that sincere gestures always are, and Rachel had rolled her eyes the first few times and called him cheesy and told him she loved him anyway. But she kept every single one. She kept them in a box in her nightstand drawer, and sometimes, on the bad days, the days when the old loneliness threatened to resurface, she would open the drawer and read them and remind herself that this was real, that this was hers, that the man who wrote those notes was choosing her, actively and deliberately, every single day. She was standing at the kitchen window one evening, watching the sunset paint the Austin skyline in shades of orange and pink and gold, when Brian had come up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. He had not said anything. He had simply held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his breath warm against her hair. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Rachel had felt something that she had almost forgotten existed. She had felt at home. Part 16. What remains. It was a Sunday afternoon in late May, and Sophie was napping in her crib, and the apartment was quiet in the way that only a home with a sleeping child can be quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a gift, like a small pocket of peace carved out of the chaos of ordinary life. Rachel and Brian were sitting on the couch, not talking, not watching television, just existing in each other's presence in the way that people who have been together for a long time sometimes do. Their feet were tangled together on the coffee table, and Brian's hand was resting on her knee, and she was reading a novel she would probably never finish, and he was scrolling through his phone looking at nothing in particular. It was not romantic, not in the way that romance is usually defined. It was not passionate or exciting or particularly interesting to anyone but themselves. But it was enough. It was, Rachel had come to understand, exactly enough. She had been thinking a lot lately about the nature of love, not the love of movies and novels and pop songs, the kind of love that burns bright and burns fast and leaves you breathless and broken in its wake. She had been thinking about the other kind of love, the quieter kind, the kind that doesn't make for good storytelling but does make for a life. The kind of love that is built, not found. The kind that requires you to show up, day after day, even when showing up is hard. The kind of love that is less a feeling than a decision, a series of decisions, made in the small hours of the night and the quiet moments of the afternoon and the ordinary, unremarkable afternoons when nothing is happening and everything is, if you're paying attention, happening anyway. She had made a lot of mistakes in the past few years. She had let herself disappear. She had allowed the distance between her and Brian to grow until it felt insurmountable. She had sought validation from other men, had let herself be seen by someone other than her husband, had come closer than she wanted to admit to making a decision that would have changed everything. She had not been the wife she wanted to be, or the woman she wanted to be, or, sometimes, the mother she wanted to be. But she was still here. They were still here, together, in this apartment, on this couch, with their daughter sleeping in the next room in their complex, imperfect, exhausting, beautiful life spread out in front of them like a landscape they were learning, slowly, to navigate. And for now, for this afternoon, for this moment, for this small and quiet Sunday that smelled like sunscreen and cut grass and the particular sweetness of a child who is finally, mercifully sleeping, for now, that was everything. Part 17, the truth about wanting. There was a night, in the darkest period of their marriage, before the letter, before the therapy, before any of the hard work of rebuilding, when Rachel had stood in the nursery at 3 a.m. and looked at her sleeping daughter and felt something that frightened her more than any affair or confrontation could have. She had felt nothing at all. Not love, not exhaustion, not even the ambient anxiety that had become her constant companion. Just absence. A void where feeling should have been, like a room in a house where all the furniture had been removed. She had stood there in the dark, listening to Sophie's small, peaceful breaths, and she had thought, I don't know if I know how to love anymore. I don't know if I know how to feel. The thought had passed, as thoughts do. By morning, she had convinced herself it was nothing, an artifact of sleep deprivation, a momentary glitch in an otherwise functioning emotional system. She had gotten through the morning routine, had dropped Sophie off at daycare, had gone to work, had sat through meetings and responded to emails and done all the things that constituted a day in the life of Rachel Morrison, professional woman, functional adult, apparent human being. But the thought had stayed with her, lodged somewhere in the back of her mind like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. It had surfaced again and again over the following weeks and months, in different forms, with different phrasings. What if I've lost the capacity for joy? What if this is all there is? What if I died tomorrow? Would I regret anything? She had never been able to answer that last question. She had never been able to determine whether the life she was living, the marriage, the motherhood, the career, the mortgage, the whole elaborate performance of normalcy, was something she genuinely wanted or simply something she had fallen into. The way you fall into a routine, the way you fall into debt, the way you fall asleep at the wheel and wake up miles from where you intended to be. The wanting had come back, eventually. The wanting for Brian, for meaning, for something that felt like purpose. She didn't know where it went, or why it had left, or what had called it back. But she was grateful for, profoundly, almost painfully grateful, that it had returned. Because the alternative was worse than any suffering she could imagine. The alternative was a life without wanting. A life without hunger. A life that was just going through the motions, day after day, until the motions became the whole of existence and there was nothing left underneath. She had learned something in those dark months. She had learned that love was not a feeling but a practice. That happiness was not a destination but a direction. That the fire between two people was not a thing that either existed or didn't exist, but a thing that had to be tended, like a campfire, with attention and fuel and the willingness to sit with it even when the nights were cold. She had learned that she was capable of betrayal, not just of her marriage, but of herself. That she was capable of choosing the wrong thing, the easy thing, the thing that felt like want but was really just hunger in disguise. That desire was not the same as love, and attraction was not the same as connection. But she had also learned that she was still capable of being surprised by herself. That the woman she was at 30 was not the woman she had been at 20. That she contained multitudes, not just the good ones, but all of them, the whole messy, contradictory catalog of who she was and who she was becoming. She was not the woman who had married Brian in a courthouse ceremony 2 years ago. She was not the woman who had stood in a conference room and told Marcus Chen that she was unhappy. She was not the woman who had written that letter, or read it, or listened to Brian's confession. She was all of them, and none of them. And something else, something new, still taking shape. She was Rachel Morrison, 28 years old. A mother, a wife, a designer. A woman who had lost herself and was finding her way back. And she was still capable of wanting something better. She was still capable of wanting. Part 18. The summer that followed was the warmest of Rachel's adult life. Not in temperature, though Austin did its part, delivering week after week of the relentless Central Texas heat that turned lawns gold and swimming pools into community gathering spaces. It was warm in a different way. It was warm in the way that a house is warm when all its inhabitants are present and accounted for, when the rooms are full of life and the refrigerator hums with the evidence of meals that are actually being prepared and consumed. Brian had taken up cooking, somewhat unexpectedly. He had started with the basics: grilled chicken, pasta with jarred sauce, the kind of simple, competent meals that suggested a man who had recently discovered that eating well was not as difficult as he had imagined. But by midsummer, he had graduated to more ambitious projects: risotto that actually tasted like risotto, homemade pizza with a crust that achieved the holy grail of crispness on the bottom and chew in the center, a brisket that he smoked over oak and hickory in the backyard of their Mueller apartment complex, to the delighted astonishment of their neighbors. Rachel had watched this transformation with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something that might have been respect or appreciation, or the specific feeling of witnessing someone you love become a fuller version of themselves. Brian had always eaten mechanically. She remembered fuel rather than food, sustenance rather than pleasure. Watching him now, as he hovered over the smoker with a probe thermometer and a look of intense concentration, she felt like she was seeing a different man. Or perhaps the same man she had married, revealed at last from beneath the accumulated sediment of stress and fear and financial worry that had buried him for years. Sophie had turned 1 in July, and they had thrown a party, the first real party they had hosted since moving into the apartment. Rachel's mother had driven down from Dallas, and Brian's parents had flown in from Chicago, and for one afternoon, the small Mueller apartment had been filled with people who loved them and the baby and each other, in the complicated way that family they love each other, conditionally, profusely, with the kind of generosity that always carries within it the hope of return. The party had been chaotic. Sophie had cried when the birthday song was sung, overwhelmed by the collective attention of so many adults singing in her direction. Brian's mother had cried when she held Sophie for the first time, overcome, she claimed, by the heat and the exhaustion of travel, though Rachel suspected the tears had deeper roots. Rachel's mother had danced with Sophie on the small balcony, swaying to the old Bollywood songs that played from her phone, and Rachel had watched them from the kitchen doorway and thought, This is what I was fighting for. Not the grand romance. Not the fairy tale. Just this messy, imperfect, warm collection of people who had chosen each other and were still choosing, day after day, in the only way that mattered. The summer had also been a summer of small reawakenings. Rachel had started running again, nothing serious, just 3 or 4 miles a few times a week, out through the Mueller neighborhood and around the lake and back, in the cool of the early morning before the heat became unbearable. The running had done something to her body and her mind that she hadn't anticipated. It had reminded her that she had one. That she was not just a vessel for the needs of others, a baby who needed feeding, a husband who needed supporting, a career that needed maintaining, but a body in her own right, with its own hungers and capacities and pleasures. She had started reading again, too. Not the productivity books and parenting guides that had dominated her reading list for the past few years, but actual fiction, the kind of novel she had loved before she became a mother, the kind with complicated female protagonists and ambiguous endings and prose that did things to her brain that she couldn't quite articulate. She had read 5 books that summer, which was 5 more than she had read in the previous 2 years combined. And in each of them, she had found something she recognized, the same hunger, the same confusion, the same desperate search for meaning and connection that she had been living through in her own life. She had not heard from Marcus since his departure. She had not expected to, and she had not. But she thought about him sometimes. Specifically, she thought about the version of herself that had existed in relation to him. The version that had wanted something so badly that she had been willing to risk everything to get it. She was not that version anymore. She was not sure she wanted to be. But she was grateful for her, in a way. Grateful for the reminder that she was still capable of wanting. Grateful for the proof that the fire had not, after all, gone completely cold. #Part 19. The evening, it was a Thursday in August. the kind of evening when the Texas heat finally relents sometime after sunset and the air takes on a quality that almost resembles coolness. Rachel and Brian had put Sophie to bed, a process that had become, over the past several months, less of a battle and more of a ritual, a winding down that involved bath and pajamas and milk and the same 3 books read in the same order every single night, as though Sophie understood, at some cellular level, the comfort of predictability. They had gone out onto the small balcony of their apartment, the one that overlooked the parking lot and, beyond it, a stand of live oak trees that provided a thin green buffer against the concrete and asphalt. Brian had brought out 2 glasses of wine, red, cheap, the kind of wine they had been drinking since the days when they couldn't afford anything better and which had become, through sheer force of habit, their preferred variety. They had sat there for a while, not talking, just watching the lights fade over the trees and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, the distant laughter of kids playing in the parking lot of the apartment complex across the street, the bark of a dog, the occasional car passing on the road below. It was the kind of evening that demanded nothing of you, that asked only that you show up and be present and allow the world to be exactly what it was. "Do you remember," Brian had said, eventually, "that first apartment? The one with the radiator that sounded like a haunted house?" Rachel had smiled. "How could I forget? I still have nightmares about that radiator. I loved that place," he had said. "I know it was a dump. I know the walls were paper thin and the kitchen was basically a closet. But I loved it. Because it was ours." She had looked at him, this man she had married, this man she had almost lost, this man who was sitting next to her on the balcony with a glass of cheap wine and a thoughtful expression and the kind of quiet that only comes from someone who has finally stopped running from their own life. "I loved it too," she had said. "I loved all of it. Even the bad parts. Even the parts where we fought about nothing. Especially those parts." He had turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his face had had an expression she hadn't seen in years, or perhaps had never seen, or perhaps had only seen once, in a coffee shop in Austin on a late autumn afternoon when the light was coming through the window in thick golden beams, and she had thought, "I want to know who put that smile there." "I'm sorry," he had said. "For all of it. For the years of not being present. For making you feel invisible. For letting us become whatever we became." She had reached out and taken his hand. "I know," she had said. "I forgive you. And I'm sorry for the things I'm still going to mess up," he had continued. "Because I will. I'm not suddenly going to become a different person. I'm still going to have bad days and bad moods and days when I retreat into myself instead of reaching out. I'm still going to struggle with the things I've always struggled with. I know that too. But I'm going to try. Every day. I'm going to try to be the person you married. The person I was back then, when everything was new and I couldn't stop looking at you." She had squeezed his hand. "That's all I ever wanted," she had said. "That's all I've ever wanted." They had sat there for another hour, maybe longer, until the wine was gone and the stars were out and the neighborhood had settled into the particular quiet of a Thursday night in August, when everyone has to be up early tomorrow, but no one is quite ready to admit that the evening is over. And when they finally went inside, when they climbed into the bed they had shared for years and settled into the bodies that had learned each other so completely that the learning had become a kind of homecoming, Rachel had thought, "This is it. This is what I was looking for. Not the fire, not the passion, not the breathless wanting of those first months. Just this. Just a man who is trying. Just a life that is real." It was, she had decided, more than enough. Part 20. The beginning September came, as it always does, with the particular quality of light that belongs to the month, the last gasp of summer, the first whisper of fall, the time when the year begins to turn and everything that has grown begins, slowly, to ripen into whatever it is going to become. Rachel had turned 29. It had happened on a Sunday, quietly, without fanfare. Brian had made her pancakes in the shape of a heart, a tradition from their earliest days together that he had let lapse for years and had now, somehow, remembered to resume. Sophie had smeared avocado on her high chair tray and laughed at the chaos she was creating. The morning had been perfect, in the way that simple mornings sometimes are. She had spent the afternoon alone, a gift from Brian, who had taken Sophie to visit his parents for the weekend. She had used the time the way people are supposed to use solitude, productively, reflectively, in ways that nourished her soul rather than depleting it. She had gone to a museum, a small contemporary art space downtown that she had been wanting to visit for months. She had walked through the galleries slowly, allowing herself to linger in front of works that spoke to her and to move past works that didn't, without guilt or self-judgment. She had eaten lunch at a cafe she had never been to, a tiny place tucked into a side street off South Congress, and she had read her book and watched the people passing by and Selt, for the first time in as long as she could. Remember, like a woman with time on her hand and a mind that was her own. It had been on the drive home, watching the sun set over the Austin skyline, that she had realized something. Something small but significant. Something that changed the way she thought about her life, her marriage, the whole messy, beautiful, impossible project of being human. She had realized that she was happy. Not the all-consuming, nothing can touch this happiness of her early days with Brian. Not the shallow, performed happiness of social media and party invitations and the elaborate theater of having a good time. But the real kind. The kind that exists underneath everything else, that persists even when the surface is turbulent, that feels less like an emotion than a baseline, the water you swim in, the air you breathe, the ground you stand on. She had been so busy chasing happiness, for so many years, that she had never stopped to notice when it arrived. She had been so focused on what was missing, what she wanted, what she lacked, what she deserved and hadn't received, that she had failed to see the life she was actually living, standing right in front of her, waiting to be recognized. But she saw it now. She saw it in Brian's hand on her knee as they drove. She saw it in Sophie's laughter echoing from the next room. She saw it in the notes he still left her. Even now, months after they had begun to rebuild, she found one in her wallet that morning, tucked behind her driver's license, that said 29 looks good on you. She saw it in the therapy sessions that had become less about crisis management and more about deepening, about learning to know each other in new ways, about building something more intentional than what they had constructed in the rush and heat of their early years. She saw it in herself, in the woman she was becoming, in the distance she had traveled from the woman who had stood in the bathroom mirror and not recognized the stranger looking back. She was not the same woman. She would never be that woman again. But she was grateful for her, for the lessons she had learned, for the pain she had caused and received, for the journey that had led her to this moment, in this car, on this evening, watching the sun set over a city she had come to love for all its quirks and contradictions and unexpected gifts. The fire was not burning the way it once had, but something else was burning now, something steadier, something more sustainable, something that would keep her warm for the long haul rather than burning bright and fast and leaving her in the cold. She was 29 years old, and she was just getting started. #epilogue. The morning Rachel woke up early on a Saturday in June. The light was coming through the blinds in long golden stripes, and the apartment was quiet, and for a moment she lay there in the half-darkness, listening to the sound of Brian breathing beside her, listening to the distant hum of traffic from the street below, listening to the particular quality of silence that belongs to early mornings before the world has remembered to be loud. Sophie was still asleep. They had been blessed with a child who slept, miraculously, like the dead, 12 hours a night and sometimes more on weekends, as though her body understood instinctively that rest was not a luxury but a necessity. Rachel lay there and watched the light move across the ceiling, and she thought about all the mornings she had woken up in this bed feeling alone, feeling invisible, feeling like she was sharing her life with a stranger. And she thought about the mornings, the recent mornings, the mornings of the past few months, when she had woken up feeling something different. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for what she felt, too small. What she felt was more like recognition. The recognition of someone who has been lost and has found their way back. The recognition of a self that had been, for a while, submerged and had now resurfaced. The recognition of a life that was imperfect and difficult and exhausting, and that was, nonetheless, hers. Hers to live. Hers to choose. Hers to make meaning out of, one day at a time. Brian stirred beside her. He opened his eyes, saw her watching him, and smiled, slowly, sleepily, the way you smile at someone when you have been married long enough that the smile requires no performance, no effort, no thought. It was just there, automatic and warm, the way a heartbeat is there. "Morning," he murmured. "Morning," she said. They lay there for a while, not talking, not touching, just being in the same bed at the same time in the same quiet morning light. And it occurred to Rachel, in that moment, that this was what she had been afraid of losing. Not the passion, not the desire, not the fire that had once burned so bright between them. But this quiet, this presence, this simple, unremarkable, irreplaceable fact of two people who had chosen each other and who were, in this moment, still choosing. She thought about Marcus sometimes. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about that night in the conference room when she had told him she wasn't happy and he had looked at her with those dark, searching eyes and seen something that no one else had seen. She hoped he was happy. She hoped he had found what he was looking for. She hoped that wherever he was, he knew that what had happened between them, the almost happening, the almost wanting, the almost being seen, had been a kind of gift, even if it had also been a kind of danger. But she did not miss him. She did not miss the wanting, the waiting, the electric charge of the almost. What she had with Brian was not the almost. It was the real, the difficult, unglamorous, deeply satisfying real. She turned on her side and looked at her husband, this man she had married, this man she had almost lost, this man who was still here, still choosing her, still showing up day after day in the small, quiet ways that mattered more than the grand gestures ever could. She reached out and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and she felt it beating beneath her palm, steady, strong, alive. "I love you," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a question. It was just a fact, stated plainly, offered without expectation. The kind of thing you say to someone when you have been married long enough to know that love is not a feeling but a practice, a daily practice, a discipline, a choice you make over and over again in the face of everything that makes it hard. Brian covered her hand with his. "I love you too," he said. They lay there together in the morning light, two people who had almost lost each other, who had found their way back, who were still finding their way, still building, still choosing, still learning what it meant to love someone in the long and imperfect stretch of a life together. Outside, the sun was rising over Austin, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking and a car horn was honking, and the world was waking up, as it did every morning, to another day of chaos and beauty in the ordinary, extraordinary business of being alive. And Rachel Morrison, designer, mother, wife, woman, was exactly where she wanted to be.